Good morning, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here. I have already run into a few people who are clients and friends, not just from the last year or two, but literally from decades ago. So it is really a pleasure to be here. I'm sure I'll make more friends by the end of the day today. I think it's always important to take a moment to thank you on behalf of Tarek, my co-founder, and the rest of the team at Medidata for your business and for your trust. And for those of you who we're not working with in the audience, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. We are going to talk a little bit about what is happening in life sciences and how we are working together to bring better therapies to the patients who are waiting for them. We have a particularly interesting view of the world at Medidata. As you heard from Kristen, we have over 1,000 clients around the world. We work with some of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, and we work with some extremely small biotechs. We work with medical device companies. We work with not-for-profit organizations like Cancer Research UK. So we will give you our perspective on that, and I'll try to catch you up on everything that we're doing at the same time. As we think about bringing smarter treatments to patients, one of the trends that I think we see, a very positive trend in so many therapeutic areas, is this idea that we can be more precise with our therapies. How do we give the right intervention or the right prevention to the right patient at the right time? That is the definition of precision medicine. And that's a great thing if you're the patient. But it is a challenge if you are the person who is creating that drug or that device. Because there is, with mathematical certainty, a relationship between how precise your treatment is and how many patients will benefit from it. So we have people, actually one of our speakers later today, from companies who are making medicines that are designed for a specific person. That means, by definition, that nobody else on the planet will benefit from that particular drug, that particular formulation of that drug. And the more you expand yourself in terms of looking at precision instead of personalized, again, you deal with this problem of where are these patients. Again, we want to find them, certainly in commercial, but even in research, it gets that much harder to identify them. And the more specifically we look for patients, not only is it harder to find them, but there's more about that patient that we need to understand to figure out if they are the right patient to get that therapy. And that has the effect for all of us who are in the world of doing research. It means that our experiments are getting more complicated. We need to measure more things about all these patients. The way we're determining what the outcomes for patients are getting more scientifically rigorous and quantitative. So that means that there's an increase of data there as well, not just around identifying what patients we're treating, but what is the way we can measure safety, the way we can measure efficacy, the way we can measure value. So not only do the studies get more complex, but we actually have more and more data that we need to process. So these are the problems. Again, I think they're good problems to have. It's because we're making terrific tools for healthcare, but these are the things that we have to work through in the projects that we all run. So this is how, at least from Medidata's perspective, in terms of what we can bring to the toolkits that you all have in your day-to-day jobs, how we can help solve for those problems. Medidata is a company about life sciences. We were founded by, myself included, people who worked in life sciences, who were working with patients, who were working to create new drugs and new diagnostics. And we focus on the science of research. There is no reason to do a research project with patient volunteers as subjects unless you're interested in confirming a hypothesis. Oftentimes, business systems that are typically made to scale in an IT environment, aren't really good at hypothesis confirmation. Because every time you confirm a hypothesis, you have to make a new one. And it is an iterative process, and it does not scale in the same way as a lot of different business processes. So we have the RAVE family of products that are built around this idea that every research project will have maybe it's confirmatory, it's not always unique, but a relatively unique set of hypotheses that you start that project with that you need to confirm, was I correct or was I not correct? And I'll go through all the different modalities that are necessary depending on what your therapeutic area is to do that. So this is the science of doing a research project. But a research project is also a project. And we can't forget that. So there is a whole business to doing clinical research. Projects have milestones and resources and budgets. And these are real things that we have to deal with every day as clinical research professionals. So we try to pair what we do on the science side of research with, in the Edge family of products, the business side of research. How can we work on both of those as productively as possible? And what you see in the middle is MEDS and artificial intelligence. MEDS stands for the Medidata Enterprise Data Store. And remember I was saying that a lot of science systems aren't great or business systems aren't great at scaling at scientific problem solving? There is an impedance mismatch between the kind of data, the kind of information you'd want to look at when you're looking at the scientific aspect of a clinical development program than the business aspect of it. And what we've been doing at Medidata is investing in infrastructure that brings those two worlds together and pairing that infrastructure with the kind of analytics that allow all of us, regardless of whether we're more focused on the science side or the business side, to do a better job. Do a better job of managing resources and timelines. Do a better job of actually delivering precision therapies and curing patients. And we know, not just at Medidata, around the world, almost every industry, but certainly life sciences and certainly healthcare, data and analytics are a key to unlocking the next generation of value. Data and analytics is how we are going to run more efficient clinical development programs, how we save 25, 40, 75% of time and cost to get a new therapy to a patient waiting. It's how we are going to take an efficacy rate from a drug that's introduced and go from 25% to 75% or to something in the 90s, which is actually represented by people in this room. So if you're with me on that, if you accept how important the analytics are and how transformational what you can do with this scientific and business data is, let me tell you something that's maybe slightly sobering. And that is, in this interesting seat that Medidata has, as we watch these 1,000 companies, and as we watch, frankly, other people who are in the space of clinical trials from a vendor perspective, providing systems and providing services, we see a lot of people getting excited about the potential for data and the potential for analytics and having their strategies fail. And by the way, we have had data strategies fail at Medidata for these two reasons over the years. So let me share what I think are the two main categories for that. One reason data strategies fail is people get obsessed with co-location. All I need to do is get all my data in one place. If everything's in this big data lake or whatever the recent buzzword is, then I'll be able to answer any question. And the answer is that is not the whole problem. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of focus to get data to the point that it is clean enough, it is complete enough, it is homogenized in a way that you can start to query it and get meaningful answers. And by the way, all of us in this room should know that. That's why we run clinical trials the way we run them. So when we make a conclusion about safety or efficacy or value, we can look regulators and patients and providers in the eye and say this is a reliable conclusion, because we know as an industry we need to do that work. Well, you always need to do that work with data. The other place where people fail, in addition to being kind of too obsessed with co-location, is getting too obsessed with the sexy buzzwords, with the machine learning and, oh, I'm just going to put all my data in one place and natural language processing will make miracles happen. By the way, machine learning, natural language processing, neural networks, these things are real. Right? These are techniques that are real. They're based on statistics, and they're based on computer science. And there's an old adage in computer science, which is garbage in, garbage out, which is what I was just talking about. Your data's got to be organized and clean. And certainly, nothing in equals nothing out. So these buzzwords aren't going to produce miracles. And if you think about those two categories of failure, being obsessed with co-location or being obsessed with the analytics in absence of having great data, what you land on is really what we've landed on at Medidata from a data strategy perspective. And as I talk about some of the things that we've been working on with many of you, you'll see this theme. make sure that you have all the data that you need coming together in the right way. For most of the things that we're doing around data and analytics, part of the great value to our clients is that we do the data aggregation automatically for you. We do the curation. We do the standardization. So you don't have to worry about the beginning of this thread. And once you've got that data in a state where it is what we would call fit for purpose, you connect it with the right algorithm, with the right analytic technique, so that the result is a piece of information, a piece of knowledge, a piece of wisdom that allows you or your team in the work that you are doing to make a different decision than you would have in the absence of that information. Right? We call this the steel thread. If you're building a bridge from one place to another, the hardest thing to do and the first thing you have to do is to get a steel thread, one steel thread across that chasm. And once you've done that, it's really easy to put more and more threads wound over it, and soon you have this giant bridge. Well, this is the steel thread that is Medidata's data strategy. And thanks to many of you, not only were you doing that with the data, in some cases of individual companies, trying to help you have better decision making, we're also doing it in some really exciting collaborative ways. We, right now at Medidata, I think have the largest fit-for-purpose data repository in the industry. That's a data repository that includes operational data. I'll show you some examples of that, as well as, in cases, clinical data. We have over 600 sponsors, again, many represented in the room, who have decided to contribute their data to certain types of pools of data to get back some of this information, knowledge, wisdom that they wouldn't have been able to generate with just the data within their own four walls. They want to look at a collaborative, collective way to have better decision making. And so that's really what Meds and AI is about. There was a session yesterday, I'm sure some people in the room went to it, that was very technical and about how the inner workings of meds and some of these algorithms come together. There's more sessions today. I won't go through the technical details. But the point is we're taking all the different data sources that you see here, all the modalities that might come in a clinical trial, and giving you some unique decision-making capabilities on the other side. So let me now go into a little bit more about what we're actually doing in the platform. And I'll start with people who in the room who identify themselves more as data managers. You also might be a biostatistician. You also might be in clinical operations. You might be a scientist. You might be a physician. But you're somebody who's worried about data aggregation and data quality. You're worried about that problem of how do I get to the point that I can decide on something related to a hypothesis for safety or efficacy or value. So we'll focus on the rave side of this diagram for a minute. And I'm going to start with data from sites and data from labs. We're going to start with what a lot of us still think of as EDC. It all kind of starts with data capture. Now, I want to emphasize that this is a screen from Rave. It is physically impossible to deploy Rave and not be deploying interfaces that can be used with electronic health records. If you go on to, for the IT people, if you go on to something called GitHub, where you can see open source libraries where academic medical institutions who use Rave to conduct their own research, as well as to participate in industry research, have realized it's worth investing in tools to feed their data directly in so you don't have to transcribe everything. But what I'm really talking about is lab and CRF data. That's where this all starts. I do hear sometimes a phrase that EDC is a commodity. It's not that exciting anymore. It's just a form on a web page for people to enter data or an interface for people to push in data. A form on a web page for people to enter data wasn't interesting in 1999 when we started Medidata. But EDC, the application as it pertains to the work we do in our industry, has not ever been and still is not a commodity. This is something that is interesting and complicated and serious. And what we do is try to make it more capable and something that has that steel thread that I was talking about of capabilities to allow you to do a better job every year. Of course, in Rave, you all who use it know that you can use things like edit checks that do a kind of procedural cleaning of data, prospectively tell somebody that they made a typo and systolic pressure was greater than diastolic pressure. You're going to see some things that I'll talk about. I'm going to invite David Lee, our Chief Data Officer, on the stage a little bit later. We're going to talk about some of the things that we can do with this data as it flows into our platform from a machine learning perspective, from a patient clustering perspective. Even in terms of natural language processing and machine learning, we can do things with data coming through EDC that we could never do before. We can take the verbatim terms for adverse events and concomitant medications. Again, as I mentioned, we have the industry's largest opt-in repository of clinical data and clinical data analytics. And we use that with natural language processing and machine learning to build, we think, the most competent auto-coding system in the world. And when you use Medidata Coder, you get that auto-coding system. And it can cover terms in a way that, at a speed and at a quality level and at a consistency that humans can't. And by the way, it doesn't mean that you don't have a job if you're a coder. Now you can code by exception. And these are the kinds of things that we keep trying to build and put into the Medidata platform to make us more efficient as an industry. And actually, you'll see later how this helps us do some other types of science that we otherwise wouldn't be able to do. Not all data in clinical trials comes from the clinic visit or from relatively simple blood labs. There's a lot of information, as again, many of you know very well, that come from more complicated types of labs, including omics data. There are medical images that are critical related to certain types of endpoints, or certainly, if it's not an endpoint for you, there's probably an efficacy endpoint, there's probably a safety endpoint that you're looking at. We've always had the ability to put image adjudication data, the tabular data related to images into RAVE. The workflow was okay. But we now have the capability in the Medidata platform to ingest the images themselves, to go directly from the PACS systems, get the DICOM images, de-identify all the headers, manage the entire workflow for a radiologist to actually measure the tumor volume or whatever it is that they're evaluating the film for. I won't ask for anybody to raise their hand if they're a radiologist, but I apologize if you're planning on a big career in radiology, which, by the way, there will be, but there's going to be a lot of computers who are great radiologists soon, too. One of the reasons it was really important to us to have the ability to ingest images directly into the Medidata platform is because we know there's going to be more and more algorithmic evaluation of those images to get more specific quantitative views of some of these safety and efficacy endpoints. And again, we now have the capability to do that directly in the Medidata platform. And just as we're going to see more and more images, some evaluated by people, some evaluated by algorithms, we are going to continue to see more and more omics data in our clinical trials. The person who runs our omics project in our data science team would point out to you at this point that if you have a clinical development plan and it is not tied to a selection marker, a biomarker related to what patients should or shouldn't get your therapy, you probably have something, a high single-digit % chance to go all the way from the lab you decide to put into a phase 1 study to actually get that drug approved, so maybe 7-8% chance. If you tie that drug to at least one identification biomarker, and most of these are on oncology today, but there is absolutely no molecular biology reason why it's going to remain tied to oncology. And I'm a molecular biologist, you can trust me on that. As that expands, we're going to see right now one selection biomarker takes you from whatever it is, 7-8% to about 25. So as we get much better at finding the patients for precision therapies, and we're going to see tools like this become that much more important. It's going to be part of the workflow for data managers and clinical operations people and biostatisticians every day. And I know a lot of your companies really well, so what I'm about to say does not apply to everybody, but most of the time, from our seat with 1,000 companies that we look at, the biostats department works over here, and the biomarker identification department works over here, and they both get their data at the end of the clinical trial. And again, one of the things that one of the very astute geneticists at Medidata pointed out is two things are going to change. These people are going to be working together, and that's one of the things. And they're not going to work together at the end of the trial. They're going to start to work together at the beginning of the trial. We are all doesn't matter what department you're in, if you're doing research projects, you're pretty much in the business of hypothesis confirmation. You start the project with a protocol that says, please confirm these hypotheses. Here's my endpoints. And we're going to be more and more in the business of hypothesis generation. So what you're seeing here is kind of a picture of how the Medidata platform is becoming a place to allow groups like biostats and biomarker identification to work earlier together and to be in this hypothesis generation business. So this is an automatic clustering analysis that's done by combining in real time the data that comes in through omics data that comes into the Medidata platform with site and lab data or image data or patient-reported outcome data that we'll get to in a minute. In the Medidata platform, and starts to show you, well, this is a cluster of patients who seem to be responders based on their biomarker profile, or this is a cluster of patients that seems to have a safety issue. And by the way, those are not two theoretical examples. Those are two real-world examples where we used our omics capabilities and helped a client, in one case, identify a potential safety-related biomarker, and in another, identify a potential efficacy biomarker that they otherwise would not have been able to get this way. So this is part of the next generation of how clinical trials will run from a systems perspective. When you're running a clinical trial, and we will talk about how randomized controlled trials are going to change in structure, but we are not going to get away, I think in the short, medium, or long-term future, from having experiments, this is just good scientific method, where we randomize patients. Maybe we randomize them still in some cases to a placebo, some cases maybe to standard of care. Hopefully more and more, again, we'll paint paths there for you, where we randomize them to an alternative therapy that isn't one that we are hypothesizing isn't as good, but actually we can change the way we randomize and randomize somebody to the therapy that we think will be most effective for them as a patient. This is how things like the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society's Beat AML master trial work. More and more studies. There's a glioblastoma study starting up around this same idea, where you randomize people dynamically based on their biomarker profile, so you need to ingest it, based on what we think from the past history of other people who've been enrolled in the same therapeutic area, the same indications, similar drugs. How can we look at their medical history, their drugging history, and pick the best therapy? Well, now you understand why we have to bring all these types of data together. We can do it on the Medidata platform, and then actually randomize that patient right in there, that same system where we've actually gathered all that other data. And we are going to be in a world at some point relatively soon. I think this is both commercially good for those people in the life science industry and certainly ethically good from a medical perspective, where not only are we going to randomize patients to the best possible thing we can from an outcomes perspective, but we're also going to wind up re-randomizing patients. Right? So a patient is failing their second-line therapy. Can we randomize them to a third-line therapy? So we see this idea of having not just the ability to collect all the different kinds of data, all the different modalities that we collect in a clinical trial in one platform as an important thing, but we think it's going to be important for all of us doing our jobs in this industry to be able to really think about the structure of the experiment itself and who is that patient and what therapies am I putting them off or switching them to. That's why it's so important for us to have randomization and the management of all the supplies that goes with it in the same platform as all of the clinical data. The last thing I'll touch on the rave side of the house before we get into talking about the patients themselves is biostats and safety. So you will see, as you did with the picture I showed before of the clustering of data, the genomic data in the patients and who's the responder, who's not the responder, I think for a long time, for most people in this room, Medidata will be a platform where you gather a lot of data, and that data comes out in data sets that you use to do some analyses and generate tables and listings and figures. But you're also starting to see, and we'll show you some more examples too, where one of the things that the Medidata platform produces from a biostats perspective are some tables, listings, and figures, some things that you can interact with, not static ones, but again, part of what's in hypothesis generation. And the other part of what we do with groups like biostats and safety is transactional. So there's data that is coming in. As many of you know, I think Safety Gateway is well used by a lot of companies represented here today. There's a lot of data that comes in from EDC, from labs, that then needs to go on to pharmacovigilance systems. We make that very easy from a technical perspective in terms of transferring that data. But really importantly, we make that easy from a workflow perspective. How do we make that easy for the pharma company or the device company that's managing that workflow of getting their E2B data out of their clinical trial systems and into their safety systems? How do we make that easy for the doctors and nurses, the poor people at the sites, which, as some of you know, I used to be one of them, who are trying to get through their day with 10 different systems from some companies and all kinds of disparate processes and having copied data multiple times. Things like Safety Gateway allow us to have a really great experience for those doctors and nurses because they go into one place and manage all their data. So I've talked about what happens if you're a biostatistician. We talked a little bit about what happens if you're a data manager. Talked about what happens if you're in ClinOps, which we'll get back to more with Edge. Talked about being a scientist. We haven't talked much about being the patient. And there's one more part of what's in the Rave family of products that we think is incredibly important, and it's going to become increasingly important in the next few years. We have lived in a world where patient-reported outcomes have been an increasingly important piece of what regulators want to see, of what payers want to understand. But we are in a world now where things that used to be subjective, a patient-reported outcome, is turning into something that is objective, a measured patient outcome. We are moving from a world where things that were measured once in a while in clinic to be something that we can measure continuously for a patient in their life outside of the clinic. And we realize that engaging with patients the entire time that they are in a clinical trial is actually a great hypothesis generating data source for how your patients are going to interact with your drugs, your devices, your therapies in a commercial context as well. And that's another reason why dealing with these patients directly is really going to become a first-class job of, I can tell, everybody in this room. We have worked really hard to make Medidata a place where, the same way I was saying the site can go and get all their work done in one place, well, we've also worked really hard to make it the platform where a patient can go and do everything they need to do in one place. And to talk a little bit more about this, I'm going to invite my friend and colleague Anthony Costello to the stage, who runs the Medidata mobile health team. Welcome, Anthony.
Hey.
What shall we talk about? Let's talk about Patient Cloud.
That sounds good. Let's talk about Patient Cloud. So, I think you already did a great job introducing this idea. When we talk about patient scarcity and the complexity of trials, one of the things that we see at Medidata, and we work really hard on the Patient Cloud team to develop technology for this, is the data capture component of these research studies moving more and more away from the site. So it may be fluid data from a sensor, like you talked about. It may be ePro, which most of the people in the room are probably already doing ePro studies. But we're also starting to look at how these technologies come together. So many of the vendors in this space will provide single point solutions for some of these technologies. Some of them connected to Rave, some of them may be connected to other EDC platforms or other eClinical platforms. We're trying to build the Patient Cloud platform to stand on its own as a digital patient platform, but also as a critical part of the overall Medidata platform, so that as data capture move more and more away from just only being done at sites, they can be done by a platform that's integrated together with all of these different technologies for ease of use.
It's a leading question because I know the answer. In terms of just the basic patient-reported outcome, ePro, eCOA, what are the skills that I need as an organization to deploy that on the Medidata platform versus just deploy Rave study?
Well, there are a lot of components to deploying a patient cloud study. And it's also a very rapidly changing market space. So there's sensors, there's lots of them, there's new ones every day. There's device provisioning, there's data ingestion, there's standards, there's regulatory issues country by country. So it's a complex business, and I think what we want to emphasize here today is that we're starting with the design, what works for patients, what patients can easily implement in their real lives. We're trying to make this designed to be integrated into real life so that if you're a customer that uses the Medidata platform and you see the vision that we see for the future, data becoming more and more focused on e-source, patients becoming the source of that data capture, that we have a platform that's suited for that.
So it's this one platform idea that we talked about with all those other data modalities. You don't have to manage your ePro and eCOA separately from your images, separately from your lab and site data, separately from your omics data. It all comes into one place. So we can take you through kind of the whole breadth of what we can deliver in the patient cloud platform.
Yeah, so if this is the workflow from a patient standpoint for a study, patients are educated about the trial, they're consented, they're registered, we collect data from them, we do whatever other types of data ingestion or data synchronization are necessary for that study, and then at the end we're analyzing data. So if this is the flow for a patient on any trial, what we're trying to do at the bottom of this slide here is show you the underpinnings of capturing all of that information as part of the patient's integrated life throughout the course of the trial. So you can see in the first few steps, we've got enroll, that's our e-consent system. We're educating patients at home on consent. We're screening patients, and we're moving them into the other parts of this trial where sensors may take over and they may be capturing more data or giving us more data through ePro devices. Last year at Next, we announced the acquisition of Mitris, my former company, and we rolled out the Medidata version of Enroll, which has now been completely integrated with Rave and Rave ePro, eCOA. So we have an end-to-end seamless onboarding experience for patients now in the platform, from reviewing consent information to signing consent to being counter-consigned on consent to automatically being created with a subject ID in Rave, and then through a single sign-on through iMedidata, as well as integration with all of the ePro technologies or sensor technologies we may be using on that study, you have this one end-to-end seamless solution for the patients and the sites.
So I consent the patient's record is created, and whether it's ePro or any other modality of data, it all winds up in that meds repository for that patient. There's something on the last slide, in addition to Enroll and the ePro and sensor stuff we talked about, which was virtual trials along the bottom. So maybe we can tell a little about what we're doing there.
So one of the new parts of our patient cloud platform that we're rolling out this year is what we call Medidata Engage. And this is our virtual trial platform, already being used in some key studies around in the United States. The rest of the Medidata patient cloud platforms used extensively throughout the world. Virtual trials are starting in the US. And we've got a couple of key studies here that are implementing this technology, and I think what we're hoping to be able to bring to the industry is a methodology for completing what we call hybrid studies, and we'll talk a little bit on the next slide about the trial dial. And our idea behind the trial dial, and Glen has been very involved in developing this concept, is that there probably won't be a lot of clinical trials that are done 100% virtually anytime soon. We also don't believe that 100% site-based trials will continue to be the predominant way that research is conducted. We think it's much more likely that there's going to be a hybrid approach to most study designs that include components of the patient cloud platform, like ePro, but also additional ways to collect data through sensors or for patients doing all of their case report form data entry from home. So we have a technology for doing a fully virtual trial. If we back up one slide, we're implementing this on some studies now, including this one, which I want to point out because it's the largest virtual trial that's ever been done, to our knowledge. There are 15,000 patients being recruited on this study. There are 100% virtual visits, no site visits for the 3 years that these patients are on study. We're evaluating low-dose versus high-dose aspirin. This is a PCORI-sponsored trial.
And the patients are being recruited directly out of an electronic medical record, right?
Patients are recruited directly out of medical records. We do other virtual trials where patients are recruited through social media. But in all of the cases where we're doing a virtual trial, we have somewhere along this continuum from 100% virtual to partially virtual, partially site-based data capture.
And this trial is not theoretical. This is running with thousands and thousands of patients in it.
I believe there are about 9,000 patients on the study today, very active patients, collecting data every day, and the study will enroll up to 15,000.
And we really think, as Anthony was saying, that depending on the therapeutic area, if you're in a relatively simple treatment situation, maybe you have the patient come in for a baseline visit and along the way, and you close out the patient in the clinic, but maybe they're going to get their blood drawn somewhere else, or somebody's coming to their home, and that study's 80% virtual. But even in the most complex oncology study, there's a lot of visits that could be eliminated where we're just checking on the patient, checking AEs, conmeds. The advantages to the patient, the advantages to us as clinical trial professionals is high, and so we're really excited about this.
Very excited.
Cool. Thank you, Anthony.
Thanks.
So as we're talking about patients, and we're in Europe, which is one of the parts of the world where I think there is the highest level of sensitivity around all personal data and privacy and security, I think it's worth taking a moment for a little sidebar around that. We see security and privacy as one of the things that we deliver to our clients, the same way we deliver the products that we were talking about. We look at people, we look at process, we look at technology. We hire companies to come and hack into us. We sponsor contests at Medidata where we try to hack into ourselves, including with social engineering between team members. We have clients come in the same way some people, almost everybody does regulatory audits, some people come in and do IT audits. We think all of this is terrific. It allows us to make sure that we have the best possible infrastructure from a security perspective. We go out and proactively make sure that we are conforming to all of the relevant regulations and finding all of the different certifications that we can apply to and get qualified as. I think we have more badges than anybody else out there in terms of what we've got up here. And hopefully this shows our interest in and hunger for making sure that we are investing in this in the right way for you. So we become a concentration point for this problem of everybody in the room. And by the way, that does not end with security, that includes privacy. So when you are working with US patients and you're doing a virtual trial, like the one Anthony was just describing, we take care of all of the HIPAA compliance. When you're working with our imaging solution, we de-identify the images and make sure that there is no personal data in your clinical trial records. Again, we're a concentration point to do that. Let me move on to clinical operations now. I talked a lot about the scientific piece of data capture, and Anthony talked about how we connect directly with patients, but we haven't really talked a lot about this problem of timelines and budgets and people. And this problem is real. So let's go to the edge side of this diagram. So clinical trials are projects. I said that in the beginning. Again, hopefully you agree with me. We probably have a biased sample in the room of people who probably would agree with me. So what's the best way to make a project work? One of the easiest ways and best ways to make a project work is to start with the right plan. Right? Start with the right project plan. And what we have in Study Design Optimizer is a tool to do just that. Is it automatically going to give you the perfect study design? Absolutely not. But it will give you an objective view that every single person on your study team can look at and understand how complicated this study is going to be, how hard this study is going to be for the doctors and nurses who are participating in it, and as of a couple days ago, what the patient burden in that study is going to be. A quantitative score, an objective way to look at how much time, how much physical pain based on patient interviews and third-party data that we were able to acquire, is it going to be an appealing study to actually enroll in? Or do you have a part of your arc of the study where it's going to be particularly onerous to be a patient and you should be thinking about how many dropouts might happen then? And by the way, it might be that your study needs to be complicated. It might be that your study needs to be hard for the sites. And it might be that your study needs to be painful for the patient because there's value in the therapy. But you should know that before you start the study. And this is one of these things where it's not just data from one company. This gets benchmarked against data across part of that opt-in repository that I was talking about. We also use that opt-in repository to allow you to pick the best sites to work with. Right, so I often point out, I know I have to some of you in the room, that clinical trials are difficult because most of the people who work in them don't really care about your timelines or budgets. The doctors and nurses, except in a phase 1 dedicated facility, who are treating patients in your clinical trial, walked into the office in the morning to practice medicine, not to hit your study timelines. The patients who volunteered to be in your study did not come into the doctor's office worried about your time to market. They came in to get treated. Of course they did. But your operational outcomes depend on them. And one of the things that we've tried to do is introduce tools so you can figure out where you're going to find those patients, where you can find the physicians and the staff that will run reliable clinical trials for you based on their historical performance and based on a view of how many other trials they might be doing in the exact same indication that would be competitive to you at their facility. So maybe they are a great source of patients with a particular medical history and a particular indication. But if you're one of 30 companies that are fighting for those patients every day in that facility, you should know that. And that's what our study feasibility tool does. Let's continue to focus on those medical facilities, those doctors and nurses. I also think a recent phrase that we hear a lot when we're talking to you and your colleagues is this idea of being the sponsor of choice. How do I make sure that the best sites, who we can help you objectively, quantitatively find, how do I make sure that those best sites want to work with Glen Pharma, Glen Device Company? That's actually a really interesting question. What is it that sites want? Well, I can tell you by firsthand experience that one of the things that sites want is an easy set of tools to enter their data and manage their patients. We talked about some of that with what happens with RAVE. But the other thing that happens when you're a site is you have a contract with the sponsor of the study, and you get reimbursed, and that word is really important. You get reimbursed for the work that you perform to treat that patient in the context of that research project. Reimbursed is the right word because the doctor and the nurse does all the work. And then they wait, and 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 then they get reimbursed for the work that they did months and months ago. And if you go to any site organization that represents their opinion about how difficult it is in clinical trials, why so many sites do one clinical trial and refuse to do more, it's because they don't get paid on time, they don't get paid accurately. And by the way, I think for all of us, I don't think you work in life sciences unless you love what you do. Right? We all need to get paid too. That's part of what makes the world turn and keeps the lights on. So what we have done is integrated the scientific workflow of a clinical trial. Take the data as it is coming through RAVE. Take that master site record that is sitting in MEDS and use that to drive an automated payment to the site. The work is done, the reimbursement is made. This allows us to pay sites within what has been defined by the Society for Clinical Research Sites as what good looks like today. Reimburse them in 30 days or less. And we make it easy and scalable to do that. And by the way, we did that with a clean sheet of paper. We didn't use any of the approaches that have been used in the industry to date. So not only do we do that, but the money goes directly from the sponsor's bank account into the site's bank account. So there is no escrow. It's probably not as exciting for a small company. We've done some analyses, financial analyses for big companies. This is a big financial deal to not have somebody holding on to all of your money and dribbling out over the course of the study. Let me move on to the day-to-day work of people in clinical operations. Again, clinical operations is a tough job. Right? If you're in ClinOps, you are right in the middle of what I described before. You are responsible for all those timelines, getting all those milestones, and you are working directly with people who are great people, but are not sharing your milestones and timelines, right? They're practicing medicine. They're running medical practices. So there's a lot that we do that you would think of as a traditional CTMS. Medidata's got full CTMS capabilities. But there's also been some changes in regulation. And those changes in regulation mean that the way we manage the business of clinical trials until extremely recently is no longer fit for purpose. We need to do more. And by the way, we should be doing it differently, right? We know that in a modern context, we can take a more sophisticated, risk-based approach to how we look at managing the regulatory compliance and the operations of clinical trials. We have integrated with our CTMS a full set of tools, not spreadsheets, tools that help you design risk management plans, that help you tie those plans to KPIs, that help you think about this, like make the good plan before you start the project, within the context of a trial, or even within the context of a compound or a company. So you have a whole set of tools for doing all of your risk management, right? In addition to that, you've got all the tools that you need from a CTMS perspective to deal with your on-site monitoring, right? Trip reports get generated, visits get planned, follow-up items get followed up on, et cetera. And one of the things that we're most excited about, it's integrated with not just site monitoring, but central monitoring. So think about Anthony's virtual trial dial. Right? There can be very few studies, there will be some, that are 100% virtual, where the patient never comes into the clinic. Most of them will be somewhere where we see the patient at least once or twice, or maybe just a couple site visits that we're able to skip. So you want to be able to dial left and right. Well, when you think about a great risk-based monitoring program, when you think about how you use central versus on-site monitoring, it's the same dial. Not the same dial, but the same kind of dial. I want to be able to go to turn that dial dynamically based on how well a site is performing. How do I know how well that site is performing? Well, there's some traditional metrics, right? I can look at things like, are they hitting their enrollment targets? How many times have they told me that their refrigerator was the wrong temperature and they had to throw away trial supplies? But there's other ways that we can evaluate site performance, much more sophisticated ways. And this is another one of these data-related steel threads where you connect the right data to the right algorithms. This is a picture of data from sites. And you can't read all the axes, which is okay, it's just an example, where we're looking at different variables. And what you see plotted out, automatically computed by an untrained machine learning algorithm, so for those who are machine learning fetishists in the room, we don't need to sit there and handhold it with a person. The machine learning algorithm learns how to do this on its own. It starts to look for patterns in data. And it looks exhaustively at all of the study data and finds those patterns. And you can see that some of these data points are blue, and some of those data points are red. What this algorithm does is find not just the patterns, but identify the outliers. And this is a tool, again, takes all the data that's already coming through the Medidata platform. We homogenize that data. You don't have to do it. We do it. We make it fit for purpose. It gets tied to the machine learning algorithm, and then it results in an explorable tool with all this information and scores for how well the site was performing. And just if you zoom in on one of these, this is a graph where the two axes have numbers, but you can't see what the labels are. That's intentional as much as it hurts me to have a graph that has unlabeled axes. We took the labels off for a reason, because the point is it doesn't matter what the axes would be labeled. If you look at that arc of these variables as they're plotted against each other, and you see that line going through it, you know something weird is happening. And if you then told me the additional piece of information, which you can't see in that first two-dimensional graph, but we zoom in on over there, that line is from one site, then you really know something weird is going on there. And this is how you can use our integrated scientific and project-related tools to do a much better job of risk mitigation and risk management in clinical operations. Actually, this is what we won that award for that Christian was talking about last night, the system that brings us all together at the CARE Awards. We're really excited about this. We have seen people really move the needle in terms of looking at their data and data quality. And by the way, you don't have to use this in the context of clinical operations. You can actually just use this to check the data quality for your study. We offer something called trial assurance, where this is in addition to what you do in data management, in addition to what you do in biostats. We can teach you how to do it, but if you need it, you can send us a request. We'll actually run all the data through this that you've got in your study. We have a team that includes former FDA reviewers to make sure that we are reviewing all of those exceptions, and we write up a report that says, here's what we found. Here's what you should be worried about. Here's the risk points in your data. We had a client who used this trial assurance offering. They were going to the FDA in the fourth quarter of last year. Before they went to the FDA, they used trial assurance. We found 40, 50 things in their study. We, on average, find about 40 or 50 things in their study. They went back, they cleaned up their data, and they went and submitted in fourth quarter last year. Their drug was approved, and they're going to market in a particular indication in Q1. They already actually went live with their launch. They were in a race with another company who was not a Medidata client. Therefore, obviously, they did not use this tool. And that client, who they were in a race to market with, also went to the regulatory agency. They went to the FDA in fourth quarter, and they got sent back with data issues, and they're still working on them. So we really think that we've got scientific reason to show that this works. This is not just a hypothesis. You can actually clean up your data in a very productive way using the CSA module, which is part of the strategic monitoring capability I was showing, or again, if you just want to have us run trial assurance for you without even having to learn how to use the tool. Okay, one more thing in terms of running studies, and that is eTMF. As you know, or you probably know, we now have eTMF capabilities that are built into the Medidata platform. Same master data, it's all integrated into the things in the platform I was speaking about before. And actually one of the really cool things about that is this was an acquisition that we made at the beginning of last year. So we got the tool integrated for master data. It's now on the platform. And what we're focused on now is automatically generating the things that are in eTMF. Because about 3/4 of the contents of an eTMF are actually things that are related to managing the science and business of clinical trials and the kinds of functions that I was just describing to you on the rest of the platform. So it's going to take us a while to get to what we think is a reasonable 76% of auto-generation. But if you're not using it before then, stay tuned next year. We'll give you the update. And that's really the direction that we're taking this. The other interesting thing that we've chosen to do, as you know, we really feel like we are a company that is about science and running research projects and the very specific needs of the applications in them. We're not a company around infrastructure. We'll run those services for you in our German data center as necessary, or in the US, or using large-scale third-party internet infrastructure providers. The applications and the services are the thing that we generate value from. Well, it's the same in TMF. So for the back end of all the things in our Edge TMF and SOP management and our regulated content archive, the back end is actually Box. Now maybe it makes sense that they were a sponsor of our conference when that slide came up. Why is this great? Well, it's great for two reasons. One, Box is really good at storing that kind of content and doing document workflow. They are the biggest cloud provider of that kind of workflow, and we wanted to work with the best. But the other interesting thing about it is that most people don't generate documents, right? Actually, fewer and fewer people are going to generate documents on Medidata as we automatically generate more and more. But most people in your organizations are searching for documents. And by integrating our regulated content management with the document management platform that is used for unregulated content and regulated content at your companies, and many life sciences companies already use Box, it means that search covers everything. So for the person who's trying to find something, they don't have to figure out what eTMF application they go into. They just search their entire repository for their company, and they can find those documents. Right? So now you see what we've done around making sure that we've got one platform for everything related to the site, one platform for everything related to clinical operations. Whoever you are working in clinical trials, the patients as well, you come into this Medidata platform. I want to talk about one more thing, and that is some of the things that happen unique to everything I've already mentioned in this meds and artificial intelligence intersection. So we tried to put together a really interesting team. We tried to bring, and this happens in the technology part of Medidata, this comes in the management part of Medidata, and it definitely comes in the data science part of Medidata. Industry expertise, people who grew up in the world of medicine, science, clinical trials, ClinOps, biostats, data management, the FDA, and combine them with people who don't have those same blinders on that we all grew up with. People in data science from defense, from financial services, from the insurance industry. And I would like to invite up actually our Chief Data Officer, David Lee, who's going to tell us a little bit more about how we're taking some of those diverse skills and looking at how we revolutionize the world of not just clinical trial infrastructure, but the world of randomized controlled trials, as I promised in the beginning. Welcome, David. Thanks. So let's start with some of the stuff that we did last year.
Oh, sure. Well, this culminated in a presentation at ASCO, American Society of Clinical Oncology, with our co-authors at Roche Biostatistics and Don Barry from MD Anderson. But basically, Roche came up to us and said, well, we understand you have this incredible data asset, you have this meds platform. We run a lot of single-arm trials in our oncology portfolio, and we want to understand which of the many single-arm trials should we be advancing to later phases. And that's a huge investment decision that they're making with the benefit of a single-arm trial and some published papers. They recognized that they didn't have all the relevant data to make this decision with optimal certainty. So what we came up with, together with Roche and Don Barry from MD Anderson, was an approach called synthetic control arms to tap into the metadata repository and find patients like the patients in the single-arm trials, match them on all the prognostic factors that one would expect in the indication, and this one happened to be an acute myeloid leukemia, and create an apples-to-apples comparison that you're normally used to seeing at the end of a two-arm or randomized clinical trial, but you have those results before you even invest in those larger trials.
So the data sets look like the SDTM data I'd get for a single study, but with multiple studies as the source.
Yes, so the Medidata Enterprise Data Store obviously has data from many trials, from many sponsors, and we select based on inclusion-exclusion criteria to make sure that we have the right patient's data in the synthetically derived control arm.
Right, and we don't expose data that's not yours back to the person who's using this service. It's all de-identified and aggregated, but it allows us to do things like this.
Right, so the picture shown here is typical survival analysis that you would see at the end of a randomized controlled trial, two arms. The single arm trial gives you the green data, the survival of your patient population over time, with the blue confidence bands around it. Usually in single arm trials, the sample sizes are small, so the confidence bands are wide. The synthetically derived control arms oftentimes have more patient data. So you can see the survival chart for the synthetic arm patients in orange and the relatively narrow gray confidence band. The distance between the green and orange lines shows what looks like efficacy for this particular study.
And I can go and change my inclusion and exclusion criteria and repaint that Kaplan-Meier curve dynamically. Huh?
Yes, yes. So you can see the checkboxes on the top. So if you wanted to see different patient subsets, you could see that as well. One of the benefits of getting the dynamic view rather than a static view in a paper report.
So this is another example of where we're actually showing you a figure right in the Medidata platform that you can use in an interactive way, again, for hypothesis generation, as promised before. And this is just one of the scenarios where we see this being useful.
Yes, that was the ARM, synthetic control ARM example. Obviously the data that powers the ARMs could be used for other exploratory purposes. So we also offer something called synthetic control data, which is more exploratory to help inform decisions around study design, to help you assess and benchmark what types of adverse events you should expect for a particular patient cohort that you can filter down on.
And I want to be perfectly clear, there's a lot of data sharing initiatives that are going on in our industry, which we think are fantastic. So this is in no way in a substitute to what you see Project DataSphere doing or Transcelerate trying to do. This is a very different kind of offering where, again, it's not shared discrete data. We de-identify, aggregate, and do the work to homogenize and pair with the analytics to make these tools available. And we have all kinds of cool stuff we're going to be working on next.
Yes, so augment RCTs, that's the key word for future work that we're doing, some concurrent work that we're doing with sponsors, with partners, and with regulators to help the community, the scientific community, understand the statistical rigor behind the use of synthetic control arms so that one day we can actually replace some or all of the concurrently run control arms in pivotal trials.
Thanks, David, and thanks all of you. Hopefully we showed you a little bit what we're doing and where we think the industry is going to go. Thank you.